Medieval knights battling it out in elegant duels of honor. It's the ultimate Hollywood fantasy. But what if we told you the reality was more like a muddy mosh pit of desperation? In this video, we expose how clean movie battles completely ignore the chaos, sweat, and sheer terror of surviving a medieval battle. The truth about medieval armor: heavy, hot, and far from invincible. Let's take a closer look at the reality behind medieval armor. The truth is, wearing a full suit of plate was less about looking heroic and more about enduring discomfort and fatigue. Underneath the metal, every knight wore a thick, quilted gambeson. This padded jacket cushioned blows and protected against chafing, but it also trapped heat and sweat. The result? Soldiers often felt like they were wrapped in a heavy, damp blanket, even before the fighting began. The armor itself only made things worse. Once the helmet went on, the temperature inside could soar above 100 degrees Fahrenheit after just 20 minutes of action. There are accounts of knights losing up to 15 pounds of sweat in a single day, or in some cases, collapsing from heat exhaustion before the battle was even over. Despite popular images of knights moving with ease, a full set of armor could weigh between 50 and 70 pounds. This weight slowed movements and drained energy quickly. Dehydration and heat stroke were constant threats, sometimes removing more soldiers from the fight than enemy weapons. The idea of grabbing a drink or taking a breather was out of the question. Once battle started, exhaustion set in fast. The physical toll was relentless, and endurance mattered just as much as skill. Movies often show armor as an invincible shield, but that's misleading. While plate armor offered strong protection against slashing weapons, it was far from foolproof. Medieval weapons were designed to defeat it. Longbows and crossbows could pierce weak points at the joints or under the arms, and polearms targeted gaps in coverage. But the real danger often came from blunt weapons like maces and warhammers. These weapons didn't need to break the armor to be deadly. A powerful strike could shatter bones or cause internal injuries, even if the metal remained intact. In fact, about 40% of armored knight casualties involved broken bones, despite the armor holding up. The force of a blow could leave a knight with broken ribs, concussions, or worse. Armor was never a guarantee of safety. The helmet, while crucial for protection, brought its own set of problems. Vision was limited to a narrow slit, making it difficult to see the chaos around you. The heat trapped inside turned the helmet into a small oven, further draining a fighter's strength and awareness. The sense of isolation and disorientation was real, especially when surrounded by noise, confusion, and the threat of attack from any direction. Armor maintenance was a constant struggle. Once the fighting started, armor quickly became muddy, dented, and blood-stained. It rusted easily in damp conditions and required constant cleaning and repairs from squires after every engagement. If maintenance was neglected, rust and damage could weaken the armor's protection, putting the wearer at greater risk in the next fight. The spotless suits seen in movies would have been unrecognizable on a real battlefield. Dents, scratches, and rust patches were the norm. Not every knight could afford a perfectly fitted, high-quality suit. Many wore mismatched or second-hand pieces, and the quality of mass-produced armor was often questionable. Rust, loose handles, and poorly tempered metal were common problems, making some armor less reliable than others. The financial burden of good armor was high, and many knights relied on inherited or pieced-together sets, further undermining the myth of uniform, gleaming ranks. Wearing armor marked knights as elite, but it also made them targets. Opposing soldiers would gang up, hoping to pull down a heavily armored foe and attack vulnerable spots. Fights rarely played out as one-on-one duels. Instead, knights often found themselves struggling to stay on their feet in the middle of a mob, trying to avoid being overwhelmed and dragged down. In the end, armor was just one part of surviving a medieval battle. It offered protection, but it also demanded incredible stamina and brought its own dangers. The reality was a test of endurance, not just skill or bravery. And once the battle began, the chaos and confusion on the field made every advantage uncertain. What happened when knights finally clashed in combat? The answer reveals just how far removed the truth is from the clean, choreographed duels we see on screen. The reality of combat: chaotic scrums, not heroic duels. On a real medieval battlefield, the idea of an honorable duel faded fast. The most effective tactic was to overwhelm an opponent with numbers. 5 against 1 was considered good strategy, not poor sportsmanship. Survival, not glory, shaped every decision. Instead of single combat, fighters found themselves packed together in a crush of bodies, struggling to stay upright and breathing as chaos broke out all around them. There was no room or time for elaborate swordplay. The close quarters meant that most soldiers had only a few inches, sometimes as little as 6, to move their weapons. Rather than swinging in wide arcs, they jabbed, shoved, and struck wherever they could. In these conditions, brute force mattered more than technique. The sharpness of a blade was less important than the ability to land a blow hard enough to make a difference, and every movement risked attracting the attention of more enemies. While trying to fend off one person, fighters constantly worried about being attacked from behind. The noise was relentless and overwhelming. Soldiers were surrounded by the sounds of metal clashing, people shouting, and the cries of the wounded. Modern analysis of medieval accounts shows about 70% of soldiers made involuntary screams they couldn't recall afterward. These noises weren't battle cries. They were raw, instinctive responses to fear. The sensory overload made it difficult to think clearly, and the constant barrage of sights and sounds left many fighters operating on instinct alone. Formations that looked organized at the start of a battle quickly collapsed. Within minutes of contact, the lines blurred and units broke apart. The crush of bodies, limited visibility, and lack of clear signals made it almost impossible to maintain order. Soldiers often lost track of their own side, and confusion reigned. Records from Talton in 1461 suggest up to 1 in 10 casualties were friendly fire. The inability to distinguish friend from foe, combined with the chaos of battle, meant that mistakes were common and deadly. Disorientation was a constant threat. After the initial clash, many fighters couldn't even tell which direction they were facing. About 60% of soldiers lost their sense of orientation, turning the battlefield into a swirling mass of individuals fighting for survival. In this environment, higher brain functions often shut down. The stress and fear pushed the human mind to its limits, and many soldiers entered a state described as battle mind. In this state, fighters felt detached, sometimes as if they were watching themselves fight from a distance, their actions driven by instinct and muscle memory rather than conscious thought. The pressure and fear often broke down any sense of chivalry or honor. Knights and common soldiers alike abandoned codes of conduct when faced with the reality of violence. Staying alive was the only real goal. Fighters ganged up on anyone who fell, striking until there was no chance of them getting back up. The priority was to reduce the number of threats as quickly as possible, by any means necessary. Retreat was common, and, for many, the most rational choice. Up to 40% of soldiers might flee before the fighting reached its peak. This wasn't a sign of weakness. Most medieval soldiers had families, farms, or homes they wanted to return to. The hope of survival outweighed any idea of dying for honor. Even knights, who were supposed to embody bravery, would turn and run if defeat seemed certain. Medieval battles were not about displays of skill or moments of heroism. They were loud, confusing, and brutal, shaped by fear and the need to survive. The chaos left little room for anything but instinct and luck. In the midst of this, the weapons carried by these soldiers played a decisive role, not as elegant tools of chivalry, but as instruments designed for one purpose: to inflict as much damage as possible. Weapons of war, designed to destroy, not impress. Weapons used in medieval battles were chosen for one reason: their effectiveness in the chaos of combat. The sword, often seen as the ultimate symbol of the knight, was actually a rare sight on the battlefield. A good sword could cost as much as a small house, which meant only nobles and professional soldiers could afford them. Swords demanded years of training to use well, and their value made them more of a status symbol than a practical weapon for most. Many battlefield swords show signs of repeated repairs, underlining their fragility and the high cost of keeping them in fighting shape. For most combatants, swords were out of reach both financially and practically. Spears, on the other hand, dominated the battlefield. About 70% of medieval soldiers carried spears because they were cheap, easy to make, and required little training. A spear's reach allowed fighters to keep some distance from their enemies. But in the crush of battle, these same weapons often caused accidental injuries to allies. Tight formations and limited visibility made spear wounds from friendly hands a common problem, adding another layer of danger to already chaotic fighting. Maces were designed specifically to deal with the problem of plate armor. A mace was a simple, brutal tool, a heavy metal head on a handle, sometimes flanged or studded, made to crush rather than cut. The force of a mace could break bones and cause internal injuries even if the armor itself held up. Religious knights often favored maces because, according to church restrictions, they didn't technically shed blood. This practical approach allowed them to follow the rules while still inflicting serious harm. The mace's design was straightforward, but its results were devastating. Battle axes were another common choice, known for their ability to chop through shields, armor, and bone. They were affordable and didn't require much skill to use, making them accessible to many soldiers. The axe's power came at a cost. If it became stuck in an opponent or their armor, the user was left vulnerable while trying to retrieve it. Battlefield records mention axe wielders being killed in the act of freeing their weapons, a reminder that even effective tools could become liabilities in the wrong moment. Improvised weapons were also a significant part of medieval combat, especially among common soldiers. Up to 20% of these fighters used farm tools such as flails, pitchforks, and sharpened shovels. These improvised arms were often the only option for peasants pressed into service, and they proved surprisingly effective. The shock of being injured or killed by a farming implement added a psychological edge, while the crude brutality of these tools made them deadly in desperate hands. The quality of weapons varied widely. Many mass-produced arms were poorly tempered or broke easily, forcing fighters to scavenge for replacements in the middle of battle. This lack of reliability put ordinary soldiers at a disadvantage, making survival a matter of luck as much as skill. A weapon that snapped or failed at the wrong moment could mean the difference between life and death. The wounds inflicted by these weapons were severe. Maces crushed bones and ruptured organs, often leaving no visible wound but causing fatal internal damage. Axes and other edged weapons rarely made clean cuts. Instead, they tore and mangled flesh, sometimes severing limbs entirely. Even minor wounds could become deadly. Medical records from monastery hospitals show that for every soldier killed outright in battle, 3 more died later from infection. The lack of effective treatment meant that surviving the fight was only the first hurdle. Many succumbed to their injuries in the days and weeks that followed. These realities strip away any illusion of medieval warfare as an arena for honor or glory. The weapons were crude, the injuries were horrific, and the aftermath was often worse than the battle itself. Instead of the heroic contests we see in movies, medieval battles were shaped by chaos and fear, with survival often coming down to endurance and luck. The romantic image of knights in shining armor hides the reality: mud, confusion, and moments where exhaustion proved as deadly as any weapon. These were not contests of honor, but harsh struggles where most simply hoped to make it out alive. Understanding this side of history helps us see the past more clearly and appreciate how much modern warfare relies on discipline and organization. Now, when you watch those knights riding off into the sunset, remember this carnage and ask yourself which version feels more real. If this peek behind the scenes changed your view of medieval heroism, like and share so more people can see the truth.